In medieval England, the reality was much more grim, cruel, and merciless than is commonly believed. We are used to the images created by romantic novels, folk tales, and Hollywood films, where farmers, although they work but find joy in small things, are surrounded by a loving family and a strong community, and their lives, even if difficult, are filled with simple pleasures and spirituality. Are you ready to look beyond the idyllic veil and find out the real, unsightly truth about what these cozy huts really smelled like? What those who made up the vast majority of the population of medieval England ate or didn't eat, and what they risked every moment of their brief and joyless existence? Not a general, not a centurion, but a simple legionary, Gaius or Marcus, yesterday's peasant or urban poor, who traded his freedom for 25 years of service in exchange for a stable ration and a phantom hope for the future. Not a general, not a centurion. How the cruel feudal system made people property, even denying them the right to their own will. Why your home would not be a cozy refuge, but a vermin-infested hotbed of deadly diseases. How primitive superstitions ruled every step, leaving people in constant fear. Stay to the end and you'll learn how an oath turned a free man into the property of the state. Why discipline was more fearsome than the enemy. What a legionary really felt under a hail of arrows. How a soldier's life differed from that of a mere plebeian. And why the brotherhood of the tent was more important than family. The average life expectancy of a peasant in medieval England was not just low, it was catastrophically short, barely reaching 35 years. It wasn't just a figure, it was a sentence that meant that most people didn't live to the age when we are just starting a career or starting a family today. Moreover, these frightening statistics are deceptive, as they are grossly overstated at the expense of the few who, by some miracle, passed through the crucible of disease and starvation and survived to adulthood. Historical data based on the study of parish and tax records show that more than half of all newborns died before their 5th birthday. It was not just infant mortality in the modern sense. It was a systemic, total extinction of infants, which today is even scary to think about. Babies died of banal starvation when mothers, exhausted by overwork and chronic malnutrition, simply could not feed their children. They died of hypothermia in unheated, drafty huts, where in winter the temperature inside barely differed from outside. Elementary infections that are now treated with a single shot, or pill colds, flu, diarrhea, have become death sentences for infants due to a complete lack of hygiene, medication, and any understanding of the principles of medicine. Even the most insignificant carapace on the skin, any cut, insect bite could lead to rapid and painful fatal blood poisoning, sepsis, since the existence of microbes and antiseptics was not even known at that time. Childbirth was one of the most dangerous events in a woman's life, where the chances of survival for the mother were often no higher than 50-50 due to lack of qualified care, infections, and postpartum complications. Entire families and even villages literally died out from diseases such as dysentery, smallpox, typhoid, measles, diphtheria, and tuberculosis, leaving only abandoned fields and ghostly huts. But the true apocalyptic nightmare that literally devastated the continent was the Black Death. This plague was not just a disease, it was a punishing hand that wiped out 30% to 50% of the entire population of Europe, including England. Entire villages were emptied to a single inhabitant, fertile fields were overgrown with weeds, and the surviving generations, traumatized by this unprecedented genocide, lived in constant, paralyzing fear of a new wave of pestilence, which, like an ominous clock, returned every 10-20 years, preventing the population from recovering and finding at least some semblance of stability. The records of those years are filled with chilling stories of entire families being found dead in their huts, or of plowmen falling to the ground at the plow. Death was not only inevitable, but also a familiar, ordinary part of everyday life, which could overtake anyone at any moment, without warning, without a reason, without a chance of salvation. This formed a completely different worldview, where life was valued not for its duration, but for every day lived, for every breath of air, and where the future was only a hazy, uncertain spot. The fear of the plague was so pervasive that people refused to touch the sick, abandoned, dying relatives, and sought safety in flight, which only contributed to the spread of infection. This was an era when one's very existence was as fragile as an autumn leaf. Forget about at least some variety in the diet, about meat or dairy products as the basis of the table, about full nutrition. The peasant's diet was so poor, monotonous, calorific, and nutritionally insufficient that chronic malnutrition was not an exception, but a constant, depressing norm. The medieval peasant lived in a state of permanent hunger when his stomach constantly ached from lack of food. The mainstay of survival was the cheapest, hardiest, and lowest quality cereals, barley, rye, and oats, from which coarse, often stale, almost inedible bread was baked, or tasteless. Watery porridges and stews were cooked that hardly gave a feeling of satiety. Wheat was a privilege of the upper classes and rarely made it to the peasant table, being too expensive and destined for the Lord. Meat appeared on the table only on great holidays, if at all. Animals, even pigs or chickens, were too valuable alive to work in the fields, to get wool, milk, eggs that could be exchanged or sold. Any attempt to hunt game in the Lord's woods was considered serious poaching and was punishable by severe torture, self-mutilation, such as blinding, cutting off a hand, pulling out teeth, or even hanging. That is why even a rabbit or squirrel was an impossible luxury for a peasant, and any game caught was kept in the strictest secrecy. But the most shocking and terrifying thing was that hunger was not just a threat, but a constant, habitual companion of life, a recurring nightmare. One bad harvest caused by prolonged rains, drought, flooding, or pest infestations, locusts, rodents, meant food shortages, skyrocketing grain prices, and guaranteed mass extinction. Historical chronicles of that period, such as the Great Famine of the early 14th century, describe unthinkable horrors that make the blood run cold. People ate quinoa, nettles, wild plant roots, acorns, tree bark, and sometimes what we now consider absolutely inedible straw, rotten leaves, even earth mixed with bran. There is evidence that in extreme desperation, they may have eaten hay to fill their stomachs. In particularly desperate times when everything edible was destroyed, cases of people distraught with hunger dug up corpses from graves in search of food, eating decaying flesh, and also documented cases of cannibalism when mothers, driven to the limit, ate their dead children. This is not just a story, it is heartbreaking evidence of absolute despair when the survival instinct pushed a person to the most terrible, unthinkable, and immoral acts. Chronic malnutrition weakened the immune system to a critical level, making the peasants even more vulnerable to any disease, even the mildest, turning them into living skeletons, unable to resist infections and withstand hard work. It was a life on the edge of survival, where every day could be the last because of empty bins. The life of a peasant was not just hard, it was a life of hopeless, hard labor, without the slightest right to release, days off, or even short-term rest. They were literally chained to the ground by their labor. At dawn, even before the first rays of the sun appeared, they were already in the field and worked until full sunset, until it was completely dark. And so it is 7 days a week, 365 days a year, with the exception of only a handful of obligatory church holidays, which often had to be broken due to urgent fieldwork or Lord's demands. Primitive tools such as wooden plows that barely scratch the ground, rather than turning it over, rough, uncomfortable sickles that blunted after hours of work, and heavy scythes that required incredible physical strength. All of this made every step, every movement incredibly energy-consuming. Plowing, sowing, weeding, by hand on all fours. Reaping. All this was done manually in any weather, under the scorching sun in summer, causing heat stroke, in torrential, freezing rains in autumn, leading to hypothermia, in the biting wind and cold in winter, when the fingers froze and did not obey. Accidents were not just commonplace, but a daily threat. Severed limbs, broken bones from falling heavy rocks or logs, deep cuts and severe injuries from clumsy tools, falls from carts or ladders, all without any qualified medical attention, which very often led to a painful death from infection or other injuries. A disability that condemns a person to starvation. In winter, when the fields were resting, the peasants did not rest for a single minute. They repaired their huts, which were constantly falling apart, prepared firewood for heating, tended their cattle, which were often kept under the same roof as people, breathing fetid air and sewage. The lack of any mechanization meant that every piece of bread, every sip of ale was obtained by grueling, continuous labor, which literally squeezed all the juice out of a person, turning his body into a tool, worn out to the limit, by the age of 30 looking 60 or 70. Medieval skeletons of peasants show characteristic changes in the bones, indicating heavy physical labor. Curvature of the spine, arthritis, joint deformities. This endless series of labor, burdened by hunger and disease, ended only with death, which often came as a deliverance. They were living machines for cultivating the land, without the right to rest, to privacy, to any kind of respite. You were not a peasant. You were a serf or villain, legally and virtually tied to the land and part of the Lord's movable and immovable property. Your life, your family, your land, it all belonged to him. You could not leave the estate without his personal permission, and escape was punishable by the most severe penalties, including branding with a red-hot iron, cutting off limbs, or death by hanging. Your birth automatically meant that you became part of his domain, and your children, regardless of your will, inherited this disenfranchised status. Under serfdom, your life was completely regulated by the Lord's will. You were required bar shinu to work 2 to 3 days a week as a corvée on the Lord's land, without any payment, and in the peak season, even more at his first request. This work involved plowing, sowing, reaping, building and repairing, and was physically grueling, leaving you with minimal time and effort to cultivate your own, often tiny piece of land. Failure to comply with corvée duties or poor performance could result in severe penalties. In addition to corvée, you paid Obroka's share of your already meager crop in grain, cattle, poultry, or eggs, and the amount of the rent could be arbitrary, depending on the Lord's greed and whim. The rent was not a fixed tax, but rather a tribute that could be increased according to the needs or whims of the Lord. In famine years, when the harvest was poor, the tax could take the last meal, condemning the family to starvation. You also paid the Lord to use his mill, kiln, and press, as you were forbidden to have your own. This meant that even making bread or butter required extra payments and effort. But the most shocking thing was that you paid the Lord for the most basic rights: the right to marry or give your daughter in marriage, the so-called merkit, payment for a marriage license outside the estate, the right to inherit land after the death of the father, the so-called heriot, when the best cattle or property went to the Lord. These payments were not just taxes, but symbols of your complete dependence. If you wanted to marry your daughter off to a serf from another estate, the Lord could demand a substantial fee or refuse permission altogether, so as not to lose labor. The Lord had the right to try you in his own manor court, where he or his steward was both prosecutor, judge, and jury. You had no right to a defense, no right to a lawyer, no right to appeal to the crown court. Your fate depended entirely on the whim of one man, who could dispose of your life, property, honor, and even body as he pleased, without incurring any responsibility for it. Arbitrariness was the norm. A lord could impose a fine, confiscate property, order corporal punishment, or even execution for the slightest disobedience or suspicion. Serfdom was a form of slavery, where people were living implements whose value was determined by their ability to work for the master. Your dreams, ambitions, and desires were all subordinated to the Lord's will, and life was reduced to an endless cycle of labor and submission. This system deprived people not only of their property, but also of their dignity, making them an integral part of the feudal machine created to enrich the landed aristocracy. Your home was not a cozy shelter, but a real, deadly biohazard zone, teeming with a hotbed of diseases. It was a one-room hut without windows, the walls of which were built of wattle fence, smeared with clay and straw, the technique of wattle and daub, or of rough stone. The roof was thatched, often leaking, which led to constant dampness and rot. The floor was earthen and rammed, which was never cleaned, and was constantly covered with a layer of straw, which was changed extremely rarely, maybe once every few months, if not once a year. This straw served as bedding for you, your family, and your livestock, which often lived under the same roof with you, especially in winter, to keep you warm. Imagine the overpowering, pervasive smell of manure, sweat, putrefaction, sewage, and acrid, thick smoke from an open hearth that filled the entire room, even if it didn't have a chimney. This smoke caused chronic lung diseases, coughing, lacrimation, and early blindness. There were no latrines. They were used to relieve themselves right outside the door, in the garden, or in open cesspools that polluted the sources of drinking water, wells, rivers, and streams. Hygiene in a medieval peasant home was a completely alien concept. The lack of any sewage or drainage systems led to the fact that human and animal waste accumulated right around the home, creating an ideal CP food for the reproduction of bacteria and insects. The rain washed away this sewage into nearby reservoirs, which often served as the only source of drinking water for the entire village. The lack of regular cleaning inside the house, especially since the cattle shared your home, made the indoor air heavy and contaminated. The unventilated, damp, and dark huts were an ideal environment for mold and fungi to grow, which also contributed to the development of respiratory diseases. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs were so common that they were considered not a problem, but a familiar and integral part of everyday life. People were constantly scratching themselves, covered in bites, not paying attention to it, because it was the norm. Infections such as scabies were widespread. These parasites were not just a source of discomfort, they carried deadly diseases, including plague, typhoid, and other fevers. For example, rat fleas were the main vectors of bubonic plague, which ravaged Europe in the 14th century, hatching entire villages and cities. Human lice could also carry epidemic typhus. This level of unsanitary conditions, unthinkable for a modern person, was one of the main causes of mass epidemics and monstrous deaths. All water for drinking and cooking was taken from contaminated sources, leading to constant outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other deadly intestinal infections. Drinking water was rarely boiled, and there was no awareness of the link between dirty water and disease. Food, often stored without proper conditions, quickly deteriorated and became contaminated with rodents and insects, which also contributed to the spread of diseases. Your life was a constant battle against invisible enemies, germs, parasites, and diseases that lurked everywhere. From the dirty floor to the water you drank, your home was a death trap, and every breath and sip of water could cause your death or illness. The world of the peasant was not only riddled with superstitions, but was completely absorbed by them. Superstition replaced science and became the basis of their distorted worldview. Widespread illiteracy meant that knowledge was passed on by word of mouth, overgrown with wild speculation, and the real causes of natural phenomena were completely incomprehensible. Any crop failure, any disease, any death in the family was not due to disease or starvation, but to witchcraft, the evil eye, a curse, or the wrath of God. People sincerely believed in fairies, goblins, and of course, witches who could cause damage, steal children, or spoil crops. For any failure, the culprit was immediately sought. Very often, it was a single woman who could be accused of witchcraft and brutally executed, burned at the stake, on the insinuation of neighbors or because of a bad harvest. Healers and midwives, the only ones who did anything to help with the illness, were also constantly under threat of being accused of heresy or witchcraft. This world was a world where magic and religion were intertwined so closely that it was impossible to separate them. Unlike the modern scientific approach, the medieval peasant did not seek logical explanations, but turned to supernatural forces. If a cow gets sick, it's not a virus, but someone's evil witchcraft. If the child has died, it is not an infection, but a witch's curse. This constant search for an external, mystical enemy created an atmosphere of paranoia and distrust. Neighbors might suspect each other of witchcraft out of envy, personal animosity, or simply out of fear. A charge of witchcraft, even without any evidence, could instantly lead to trial, torture, and a painful death. Children were afraid to go outside the village, fearing forest spirits or evil fairies. The church, although it struggled with pagan remnants, actively used the fear of hell, the devil, and God's punishment for total control over the flock. The priests were among the few literate people in the village, and their word was the law and the ultimate truth. They taught that sickness was the punishment for sin, and that failure of crops was the wrath of God, which added to the sense of guilt, helplessness, and paralyzing fear. Each accident was perceived as God's punishment for committed or even involuntary sins. This forced people to be extremely pious and follow all the instructions of the church, for fear of angering the higher powers. There was a strong belief in miracles, relics of saints, and pilgrimages as a means of getting rid of diseases or receiving blessings. Medical knowledge was primitive and often mixed with magic. Diseases were treated with questionable herbs, spells, and bloodletting, which often led to death. Instead of looking for the cause of the disease, they tried to exorcise evil spirits or propitiate Peasant God's world. So-called healers were often charlatans using a mixture of folk remedies and magical rituals. Lack of basic medical knowledge and hygiene practices led to the fact that even simple wounds could become fatal due to infections. This world, devoid of scientific understanding, was a constant source of unbearable, all-encompassing horror and a paralyzing fear of invisible forces that could destroy their existence at any moment, turning life into a constant expectation of catastrophes. Forget about any security or security concerns. The life of a peasant was not just dangerous, but a constant lottery with death lurking at every turn. The roads were teeming with ruthless bandits, army deserters, and yagami who could attack at any moment to rob, rape, or kill. Traveling alone was tantamount to suicide, and many people never returned from short trips, having gone to the seemingly harmless shopping at a nearby market or to visit relatives. Even in the village itself, local gangs or individual criminals could operate, robbing, raping, and killing with astonishing impunity, since the law was far away and rarely reached remote settlements. The lack of a centralized police force meant that the peasants were left to their own devices, and their protection depended on the effectiveness of local militias, or more often, on their own ability to avoid danger. Often, the only means of self-defense was a stake or pitchfork, which could offer only a glimmer of hope against well-armed and desperate bandits. The fear of the unknown and the inevitable retribution for any wrongdoing or simple bad luck was a constant companion of life. Feudal wars between lords were not an exception, but commonplace, and the peasants were caught between a rock and a hard place. Armies, both their own and others, passing through the land, could mercilessly burn villages to the ground, trample down crops, plunder the last of their possessions, and kill the population for no reason or regret. Often, peasants were forced to participate in these conflicts, using them as human shields or to build defensive structures, such as ditches and palisades. They were not allowed to carry weapons, except for agricultural tools and then only in peacetime, and were completely defenseless against well-armed soldiers, whose discipline was often lacking, and looting was common. And the crops, which were the only source of food, could be destroyed in a single day, condemning the family to starvation. Villages located on strategically important routes were constantly suffering from the passage of troops, which made life in them unbearable and unpredictable. Military units not only took food and supplies, but they could also take young men to serve, or worse, women and girls to meet their needs. Every military campaign left a trail of shattered lives, ravaged fields, and bottomless despair. But the most terrible thing is the local justice, which was not just cruel, but absolutely arbitrary. For the slightest misdemeanor, such as stealing a chicken, poaching a lord's land, disobedience, or even just a careless word spoken in the wrong place at the wrong time, a peasant could be blinded, castrated, severely tortured, or even executed. These punishments were intended to serve as a fearsome example to others, maintaining the absolute unlimited power of the Lord. Gallows hangings along the roads were not uncommon. They served as a constant, chilling reminder that your life was worthless in the eyes of the powerful, and that any offense, even the pretended one, was punishable by a painful death. There were no police in the modern sense, and local constables were often powerless in the face of a real threat. Or worse, they were themselves part of a corrupt system ready to sell their services to anyone who paid. Often justice was administered by the Lord himself or his bailiff, who could be unbiased, cruel, and biased, passing sentences based on personal bias, hearsay, or a momentary mood. The possibility of challenging such a decision was virtually non-existent, and the system of appeals was not available to the ordinary peasant, who had no means, no connections, and no basic knowledge of the law. Thus, every day of life was filled not only with physical dangers, but also with a constant, all-consuming fear of arbitrariness and injustice, which could fall at any moment, taking a life or leaving a person disabled. Trials were quick and formal, often without the ability to defend themselves or provide evidence of innocence, as the Lord's word was final. This total arbitrariness and the lack of any security guarantees made the life of a medieval peasant an endless series of survival tests. The concept of childhood in medieval England simply did not exist in our modern understanding. The children were not innocent creatures, but above all, potential labor that needed to start benefiting the family and the Lord as soon as possible. Taking into account that, as already mentioned, half of children did not reach the age of 5, those who survived did not have the right to play, carefree, or education. Early deaths caused by disease, starvation, poor sanitation, and lack of basic medical care meant that surviving children were treated with a certain degree of pragmatism. They were valuable, but their value was determined by their ability to work and the prospect of procreation. The sentimentality of modern parenting was a luxury that few people could afford in the face of a constant struggle for survival. Emotional attachment to children, when their survival was so much in question, was often shaped differently than it is today. Already at the age of 5 to 7, children began to perform heavy household chores. Girls spun wool, carried water from wells, took care of their younger brothers and sisters, collected firewood in the forest, and helped in the kitchen, which often consisted of an open hearth and a damp hut. Their small hands and backs quickly adjusted to the monotonous and grueling duties. The boys grazed cattle, helped in the fields, carried water, and performed small tasks that already required considerable strength and endurance. This job wasn't a game or any help. It was a full-time, often grueling job that took up most of their day. Гикиевой помощью. Это был полноценный, часто изнурительный труд, который занимал большую часть их дня. By the age of 10 to 12, they were working on a par with adults, performing grueling physical labor that literally broke their still unformed bodies, leading to chronic diseases, deformities of the spine and joints, for example, curvature of the limbs due to rickets caused by poor nutrition, as well as chronic fatigue and lack of sleep. The physical development of children was disrupted due to constant lack of nutrition and excessive exercise, which led to low growth and general weakness. They had no toys, no books, and no opportunity to study. Education was the privilege of the clergy and nobility. The vast majority of peasant children remained completely illiterate throughout their lives, which doomed them to the same hopeless work as their parents. Literacy and numeracy were completely unnecessary for their survival-focused lives and could even be considered suspicious. Their games often imitated adult activities, and their homemade toys were primitive and sparse, made from improvised materials such as sticks, stones, or rag dolls. Discipline was incredibly harsh. Physical punishments were the norm and were used frequently and ruthlessly to instill humility and hard work. Children had to be obedient and hardworking, otherwise they would be punished by their parents or, in case of disobedience to the Lord, by his bailiff. Early marriages were common, often as early as adolescence, to provide procreation and labor for the family, as well as to form alliances between families. Girls were married off very early so that they could start having children as soon as possible and work in their husband's household, which further reduced their already short and difficult childhood. Thus, the childhood of a medieval peasant was not a period of carefree development, but a time of rapid, brutal maturation, hard work, and constant struggle for survival in a world that made no allowances for age or innocence, breaking children before they were even mature and condemning them to a short and hard life full of hardships and devoid of any joy or opportunity. Your clothes weren't just rough. They were constantly dirty, greasy, torn, and worn for years without even taking them off at night to keep warm. Washing was such a rare event that it didn't actually exist in our understanding, or it took place every few months in cold, often dirty water, without using effective detergents that simply didn't exist. Clothing was made from coarse, unpainted materials such as wool or linen, which quickly became dirty, absorbed all odors, and became a breeding ground for bacteria, fungi, and parasites. Imagine the constant, suffocating, unbearable smell of sweat, sewage, smoke from hearths, which often burned right in the center of the hut, manure from animals living near people, and rotting garbage that accompanied each person, soaking their clothes, hair, and body. This smell was ubiquitous, permeating the walls of houses, clothing, hair, and the very atmosphere, creating a heavy, suffocating environment. Personal hygiene was shockingly primitive, bordering on non-existent. People did not wash or brush their teeth, which led to chronic, unbearable toothaches, abscesses, gum inflammation, and early tooth loss, leaving many in old age without a single tooth. And lice, fleas, and other parasites were considered not a problem, but a familiar, integral part of life, from which there is no escape. Daily bathing was unthinkable due to the lack of warm water, soap, and just time. And face and hand washing, if it did occur, was infrequent and perfunctory, usually just wiping with water. People were constantly scratching themselves, covered in bites, scratches, and skin rashes, not paying attention to it because it was the absolute norm and no one knew how to deal with it. Infections such as scabies, ringworm, and other skin parasitic diseases were ubiquitous and incurable, causing persistent discomfort, itching, and chronic skin diseases. This all-encompassing stench and unbearable, constant itching were so common that they were simply not noticed by the inhabitants of that time, were perceived as part of their natural existence, but for a modern person, they would become an unbearable torture experience that cannot be endured even for a few hours, causing nausea and disgust. Water for hygiene was rare. It had to be brought from a well or river, and it was valuable for drinking and cooking, not for the luxury of washing. Soap, if it existed in any primitive form, for example from animal fat and wood ash, was too expensive and coarse to be used for the body. The main use of soap, if any, was for washing clothes, which was also rare, or cleaning, but not for personal hygiene. Lack of hygiene was one of the main reasons for the spread of diseases and high mortality. Parasites carried infections, and dirty skin and clothing were breeding grounds for bacteria and rot, contributing to the development of skin diseases, eye infections, such as trachoma, fevers, and other ailments. For the peasant, cleanliness was not a priority, but an unattainable luxury that he did not even dream of, since he did not have the means, knowledge, or conditions to maintain it. His body and clothing were only tools for survival in conditions of constant filth and unsanitary conditions, and the concepts of personal hygiene were radically different from our own, formed by centuries of progress in medicine and sanitation. This ubiquitous filth and stench was not just an unpleasant sensation, but a constant threat to health, an invisible killer that lay in wait for every inhabitant of the Middle Ages. The judicial system for the peasant was not a defense, but an instrument of total oppression, arbitrariness, and merciless control. The main body of justice was the Lord's manor court, where the Lord himself or his steward was both prosecutor, judge, jury, and executioner. You had no right to a defense, no right to a lawyer, no right to appeal to the crown court. Your punishment depended solely on his whim, mood, and interests. For the slightest disobedience, violation of duties, theft of chicken, poaching, or even a sideways glance in the direction of the Lord, you could lose everything. The punishments were ostentatiously harsh in public. Fines that could ruin you and your family, public humiliation in the stocks where you could be pelted with rotten vegetables and stones, flogging to a pulp or self, mutilation cutting off an arm, leg, or ear for poaching or petty theft. The historical records of that time are full of examples of people dying from such punishments. Serious crimes, such as murder or major robbery, were subject to the immediate and often painful death penalty. Gallows hangings along the roads were not uncommon. They served as a constant, chilling reminder that your life was worthless in the eyes of the powerful, and that the slightest deviation from the Lord's rules could lead to your public and painful death. There were no police in the modern sense, and local constables were often powerless in the face of a real threat or collusion. Moreover, torture was a routine part of interrogation and obtaining confessions, which made any trial a farce. Thus, the judicial system for the medieval peasant was not a defense, but another tool of oppression and control, making them completely defenseless in the face of arbitrariness and violence. We are used to romanticizing the Middle Ages, imagining it as a time of knights in shining armor, beautiful ladies, tournaments, and cozy taverns where life boils. But behind this beautifully decorated facade was an unbearably cruel, merciless, and hopeless reality, especially for those who made up the vast majority of the population. For the peasants, their lives were not just harsh, they were a constant, grueling, daily struggle for survival, with unbearable hunger, deadly diseases, grueling physical labor, absolute arbitrariness of the lords, and the constant, all-encompassing threat of violence. They lived a short, joyless, hopeless life in filth, unsanitary conditions, and poverty, with no hope for a better future, no right to freedom or choice. They were tied to the land like cattle, and their fate depended entirely on the whims of nature and ruthless people in power. It was an era where death was not just a possibility, but an everyday occurrence, a constant companion, and each new day was not a holiday, but only a small victory in this endless struggle. Understanding this harsh, unsightly truth allows us to truly appreciate the incredible and often painful journey that humanity has taken to achieve modern standards of life, freedom, dignity, and justice. If you are interested in learning this real, unadorned story, if you dared to look into the darkest corners of the past, subscribe to our channel. We will continue to reveal the secrets of history, facts that no one dares to talk about in the 90s and movies, so that you can see the past as it really was. Click the subscribe button and get a call so you don't miss our next shocking stories.